I hope you enjoyed the chapters yesterday. It's been really good hearing back from you all. As you may have noticed, Sarah has said well done for reaching 20 subscribers. I'm very happy. Brilliant. Just in time to get this book underway. Ember's here today. He's going to say hello. Oh. Whoop. And, okay, he's not going to say hello. He's obviously scared of you guys. He likes listening to the stories, so he's always there in the background, as some of you may have heard the other day. I've had a couple more requests for Ember to join in a bit more, but he's not really feeling it today, so he's going to paw at the door because Mr. SB is cooking dinner and he can already hear and smell the nice smells coming out of the kitchen. Okay, today's chapter is called At the Top of the Cliff. A great cliff rose up from the jungle, covered in vines. It was 50 times as tall as Fred. The rock face would have been grey, but it was so covered in foliage that it seemed to rise from the earth like a growing thing, a great green extension of the jungle floor. That's what the black square meant, breathed Fred. Oh no, whispered Con. I don't want to do this. Lila's hand, clutching back on her shoulder, was shaking. Fred, could you climb that? Fred swallowed. Definitely, he lied. He stared at the great green expanse. It'd be like climbing a green cathedral, he thought. We all could. There'll be so many handholds it'll be like climbing a ladder. Max can't climb ladders, said Lila. Then one of us could strap him to their back with lianas, said Fred. I just don't think, began Con. But Fred had never wanted anything as much as he wanted to get to know what was at the top of that cliff. Where would we go if we turned back now, he said. Lila. Bless me. It's all right. Lila bit down on one of her plaits. It's all right. It's all right. Her jaw was rigid with fear, but her gaze was steady. We've got... Thank you. Thank you. I'm trying to read a book to children. Lila bit down on one of her plaits. Her jaw was rigid with fear, but her gaze was steady. We've got to try, haven't we? There might be someone up there who can get us home. They moored the raft and picked their way through the jungle towards the cliff. The trees grew so thickly that they had to force their way between them, and even though it was barely 200 metres, it took fully half an hour of hauling Max over tree trunks and navigating under branches lined with vicious thorns. Fred stood at the bottom of the cliff and laid a hand on it. The rock was warm to touch and uneven, good for finding footholds, he thought. The vines that had coated it looked strong. He tugged on a handful of thin lianas. They didn't tear. See, it'll just be like climbing the rope at school in gym lessons, he said. It'll be simple. I hate climbing the rope, said Con. So no, actually it's not that simple. I could go up by myself, said Fred, and shout down what's up there. Lila shook her head. She suddenly looked much older than the rest of them, and stern. You never split up into unfamiliar territory, she said. We're coming with you. She unwound Backer from the crook of her elbow and settled him securely on the back of her neck, looping her plaits around his body to keep him moored. But I can't carry Max. We'll both die. I can take him on my back. Fred tried to banish any hint of doubt from his voice. Doesn't Max get to choose? Max says he won't, said Max. No, said Lila. The stern look became sterner. You don't get to choose. I almost never make you do things you don't want to do at home, Max, but you have to do this. No! Yes, we're going to tie you on to Fred with ropes so you won't fall. And if you can cry if you want to, but it won't help, she began, as Max began to sob. Max didn't make the climbing any easier. His mutinous weight threw Fred's normal climbing rhythm off, and it was a very slow ascent. He breathed loudly into Fred's ear and got spit in his hair and was heavy. Fred was aching before they were halfway up. He went first, with Con and Lila following his footholds. Twice he went the wrong way and had to shout down apologies as he retreated and moved sideways, agonisingly slowly, with Max's feet digging into his ribs. You have to shift backwards, but don't look down, he called to the girls. We already did, Con called back. Her voice was strangled with nerves. "It wasn't a good idea." Fred shook a beetle off his eye and gripped another handful of vines. He hauled upwards, slowly, inch by inch. The roots of the trees growing back down the rock came into clear sight. Then the tip of the rock curved and became an incline with bushes, which became a flat land. Fred let out a yell of triumph. Lila and Con followed. Con crawled to the nearest tree and spat out a mouthful of bile and saliva and terror and triumph into the roots. "I can't believe we just did that," she gasped. Lila untied Max and gripped him tight in her arms. She was still shaking. "We did it," she whispered in his ear. "Think about how proud Mama and Papa would be. Can we tell them? As soon as we get home." Their heads were close together, suddenly a pair set apart, and Fred thought for the first time how very similar they looked. How Lila's eyes were Max's eyes, and his mouth her mouth. "We're so close now," said Fred. "This is a squiggle, I think." There was something in front of them that looked like it might be a path or an animal trail, or just an illusion. They hacked through the foliage, an uncomfortable amount of it was knee-high bushes with spikes. Fred's knees became flecked with blood, and the ground grew marshy, and flying insects mobbed them, swarming into Fred's mouth and up his nose. Con snorted like a horse, waving both hands in front of her face. "Is it far?" she asked, turning to look at Fred. "I don't know how much more of this I can take." But even as she spoke, the ground gave way. It dropped down suddenly, smooth moss on smooth stone. She didn't have time to stop and cascaded down it on her back, thumping against stones and roots. Fred launched himself after her, scrabbling to stay upright and grappling at trees. Lila and Max followed, Max on his backside, gasping in shock. They tumbled into a heap at the bottom. Fred's chin connected with someone's ankle. He shoved the ankle away and brushed leaves out of his eyes. Lila scooped back into her arms and took hold of Max's elbow. They stood with their backs to the slope at the edge of a vast expanse of stone. It was an enormous courtyard, as wide as a hayfield and at least 4 times as long. The ground was built from white and yellow stone blocks, rough-hewn but smooth at the top, as from the passing of many thousands of feet. It was set in a slight dip in the ground, so the earth rose up from it on all sides, forming a natural wall. Down the middle of the stone courtyard grew 2 rows of trees, creating a boulevard. There were heaps of stones in 4 or 5 or 6 places, as if small houses had lined each side. "My God," breathed Lila. Fred took a step forwards. Among the trees he could see half-formed stone pillars, some waist height, some taller than he was. High overhead was a thick canopy of green, forming a roof over the courtyard. "Look," said Fred, "over there." At the far end there was a vast stone wall, half crumbling and covered in passion fruit vines. Lining the wall were 4 immense sculptures, hewn out of wood and stone and taller than 2 men. Some of the stone had fallen away, but it was possible to see what they had been: a monkey, a panther, a woman and a man. "It's a city," breathed Lila. The sudden thump of a footstep made Fred spin round, bending down as he'd done days before for something to throw. A man stepped from behind one of the stone pillars. He was pointing a knife at them. "Whatever you're thinking of doing," he said, "I would advise against it." So that's quite a short chapter. Now we're going to read a chapter called The Ruined City, with some lovely drawings on there. The man was tall. His arm and hands were covered in scars and burns, old white scars crisscrossed with new red ones. He held the knife at the level of their necks, casually, as if it was a breadstick. "Like the Minotaur," whispered Con. At the man's side, close to his heels, waddled an enormous vulture with a red head and curved beak. Its head came up higher than the man's knees. That small person in the Dolores trouser suit. The man's nostrils had a high flare to them and they twitched as he spoke. His voice was deep. His accent, Fred thought, belonged among good tailoring and fast motor cars. "What's wrong with him?" There was a silence, except for Max's sobs. "Well?" said the man. He twirled the knife in his fingers. The tip of his thumb was missing. He's crying, said Fred. Why? He sounds like a dying screeched owl. Like a lion blowing on a ship's whistle. Fred's heart was red hot and beating double time. He was surprised that his voice sounded so calm. He's 5. That's not a reason. You're pointing a knife at his head, said Lila. That's not a good reason. But he lowered the knife. The man stepped closer into a patch of green sun and they could see him more clearly. His dress was exquisite but smelt pungent. His trousers, Fred saw, were quite ordinary. Green khaki, worn through at the knee and spotlessly clean. But that, along with the white shirt, torn off at the elbow and patched with coconut fibre, was the only thing about him that was normal. His shoes were made from what looked like alligator skin, with very few vines for shoelaces. A jacket, sewn neatly from black furs, hung over his shoulders. The buttons were caiman teeth. He wore leather cuffs on each wrist and a signet ring on his finger. From a distance, he might have been on his way to a country house party. Up close, he looked as though he'd reconstructed a prime minister from once living things. Con swallowed. She spoke in a whisper. Is it just me, or is he the kind of person that looks like he definitely won't definitely not kill you? Her eyes were stretched open and her skin were taut over the bones in her face. Fred's entire body had gone rigid, spine and shoulders and knees frozen, but he managed to nod his head 1/2 centimetre. He spoke out of the corner of his mouth. Not just you. The man took another step towards them. His right leg swung slightly out to the side as he moved. Fred noticed for the first time that his right foot was strapped with 3 slim, highly polished pieces of wood. Despite the limp and the scars and the stubble, the animal Fred thought was a panther. The animal Fred thought of was a panther. Something with strong jaws and sharp manners. Who are you? Said the man. None of the children answered. They looked at each other. No one wanted to be the first to speak. How did you get here? Asked the man impatiently. Fred tried to take a deep breath. Our plane crashed, he said, and the pilot died, and we all followed a map. He put his hands in his pockets, attempting to look nonchalant, while trying to find something he could fight with if he needed to. He could feel only a handful of squashed acai berries, which would not be very deadly in battle. Show me. Fred handed him the scrap of bark, fumbling in his back pocket, his fingers suddenly uncooperative and clumsy. The man glanced at it. Who drew this? Silently, Con raised her hand. Based on what? Con shook her head so that her hair fell in a protective wave across her face. Well, said the man. We found a map in a tree, said Fred, and Con made a copy when it got wet. The man screwed up the bark in his hand. Please, said Lila, don't be angry. All we want to do is get home. The man looked down at the vulture, as if for inspiration. And what am I supposed to do with you now? Nothing, just let us stay for a little. We won't make any noise, said Lila. That small one will. Max felt the man's gaze fall on him, and he began to cry again. The man let out a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a growl. Lila picked Max up. Sorry. Her voice wavered, and Becca caught the fear on her skin and let out a mewl like a cat. He's only 5, she whispered. You'll keep saying that like it's an explanation. Should I like him simply because he's small? I don't like undercooked food. Children are just undercooked adults. Con's lip began to quiver. Fred looked at her surprised, but he moved his shoe 1/2 inch so their feet touched. The man looked at them, ranged in a line in front of him, shaking with nerves and expectation. He sighed. Are you thirsty? He asked. Yes, said Fred. Very, said Lila. Very, very, said Max. He sniffed tearfully and wiped a great wedge of snot on his wrist. Wait here. He glared at Max. Don't touch the vulture. He bites when he's anxious, and it takes very little to make him anxious. Vultures have nervous souls. The man strode across the great stone courtyard. He stopped at a tree trunk, a stump of wood as wide as a well, and lifted a slab of stone off the top. Fred shielded his eyes and stared. The tree trunk had been hollowed out, and it was full of water. The man dipped a large green bowl into the water and stomped back towards them. "Here!" He thrust the bowl at Fred. The ring on the man's finger wasn't gold, Fred saw. It was bone, coated in flakes of iridescent snake scales. Fred looked at the bowl in his hands. It was made from an explorer's pith helmet. The brim of the hat bent into a lip. Fred sniffed it. The man raised his eyebrows. "I assure you it's perfectly clean," he said. Fred took a gulp. Thankfully it didn't taste of hair, only a little of the wood, birds and the rainforest. He drank deeply and passed it to Lila, who handed it to Max, who dunked his whole head in the hat. The man waited until all four had drunk. Then he took back the bowl and offered it to the vulture. As the vulture drank, the man rested his hand on the bird's head, and stroked its wattle with his thumb. His face was tense. "What is it that you want?" he said. The children looked at each other. "We want you to help us get home," said Lila. She spoke very quietly, so quietly he had to bend down to hear. "And why should I?" "I can't look after Max much longer. He has allergies and nightmares, and I don't know what I can dress him with if he keeps ripping holes in his clothes. Please help us." As she spoke, the vulture waddled away from the man's side and headed straight for Max, who was hiccuping and sniffling. A line of snot dripped from his nose to his ankle. The vulture dipped its beak to Max's feet and pecked at the snot, then wedged its nose into the side of Max's shoe and breathed in deeply through the holes in its beak. "What's he doing?" said Max. His eyes were dilated with fear, wide and round as pennies, but he reached down and touched the bald head of the vulture. It snapped its beak. Max snatched his hand back, then, more confidently, returned it to the vulture's head. It let out a guttural croak, which sounded almost like purring. Then Max looked up, smiling at the man. "He's mine now," he said. The man looked from Max to the vulture and back at Fred and Lila and Con. His face was emotionless, but his eyes were not. "I shouldn't trust the instincts of that bird," he said. "He probably just thinks the boy smells like meat. But, all right, come with me." He led them down the stone boulevard. There was a cascade of questions rumbling through Fred's head. Who was the man? How had he got there? Would he help them? But something in the man's walk didn't encourage conversation. The canopy was so thick overhead that the light filtered a succulent green down onto their path. The man led them to a place where blocks of stone and mud had been stacked to make 3 sides of a storeroom. It was empty but for the shocking blue and green flowers which grew in the cracks. Vines crisscrossed over the top, forming a roof of sorts. "Here," said the man, "you can sleep here." "Who built this? Did you?" "No," he said shortly, "I did not." He looked at the stone floor. "I might make you some reed sleeping mats tonight, if I have time. The vines will shelter you if there's any rain, more or less." "Thank you," said Fred. Con still hadn't spoken, but she nodded in thanks. "But beyond the statues, that curtain of lianas, see?" He pointed. Fred followed his hand and saw, at the far end of the city square, falling from the wall behind the statues, a great swathe of tangling creepers. They nodded. "Don't go anywhere near there. Do you understand? That's my private space." Con tried to speak, but only a strangled burr came out. "We understand," said Lila. "I mean it. Keep your word or I'll cut off your ears and give them to the vulture to wear as a hat." "Don't!" wailed Max. He put his hands over his ears. "I don't like him." "Shh, Max," said Lila. "He doesn't mean it." Fred looked at the man. He was fairly sure Lila was right, but it seemed risky to assume of a man who used teeth for buttons that he was joking. Max tugged at the man's trousers. "What time do we eat?" Max looked down at him, baffled. "Whenever you want." "Oh, but we mean whenever suits you," said Con. Her voice was croaky, but she looked relieved that it started working again. "You eat whenever you catch and cook something. That's usually how it works. unless you don't catch anything. But don't you? You're the adult. I'm an adult, certainly. Look, there are berries. There might be some bananas on the trees in the west corner, if they weren't eaten by monkeys in the night. And you can hunt. But, said Con, you're the grown-up. Her voice had truly come back now, and she scowled. Grown-ups cook for children. Those are the rules. That's how it's always been done. The man seemed to be losing patience. My dear, he crouched down in front of her, dangerously close. Which aspect of this, he waved his hand at the stone pillars, at his scaly shoes and at the vulture, makes you think I would care for how things have always been done? But that isn't how it works in the real world. This is the real world. He thumped his knuckles on the stone floor. This, here, the real world is where you feel most real. But who are? Said Fred. But please, said Lila. But don't you? Said Con. All three reached out as if to grab him. Good Lord, said the man. It's like watching a dog eat a bee. You have 6 hands between you, or 8 if you count that small one trying to eat a dragonfly. Max, said Lila, stop that. Do you at least have knives? Said the man. We have one between us, said Fred. We found it. It didn't seem like the right moment to explain that, technically, the knife probably belonged to this tall, dark, unexpectedly dressed stranger. He might demand they give him back. The man sighed. I'll give you each a flint. Then you can hunt at least. He crossed over to another stump of tree trunk, lifted a small boulder off its top, and fished out something from the hollow space. Here, they're already sharpened. He handed them each a stone, expertly chiselled to the size of a large arrowhead. Fred tested the edge of his thumb. It bit into his skin and a drop of blood ballooned out. The man raised his eyebrow. You can use banana leaves as bandages. If you lose any fingers worth eating, give them to the vulture. He handed a stone to Max. There you are, young Cacophony. That one's the sharpest. Max is too young for knives, said Lila. She tried to take it from her brother, but he jerked away and held both hands behind his back. Is he? How do you know? Said the man. He sounded interested. It's just a fact. People don't give little boys knives. I feel fairly sure I was given a knife at your age, and I turned out perfectly normal. Fred looked at the buttons on the man's shirt. They glinted white and sharp in the sun. He said nothing. The man sighed. It's getting late. You can have something from our own stores, but just tonight. Don't think it's going to become routine. You have to hunt for yourselves. All 4 let out deep sighs of relief. The man strode back to the hollowed-out trunk, bent to a pile of stones next to it. Up close they appeared to be arranged into something more definite than a pile, a rectangle, with wide slabs across the top. The man lifted 2 of the slabs, reached in, and brought out the body of a bird, plucked but ungutted. Caracara, he said, dropped it into Fred's hands. It was cool and clammy. They're common as rats here. Thank you. Could you tell us how to gut it? Fred asked tentatively. With the flints, boy. But how's the best way, sir? He added, just in case. When the first man learnt to cook, he did so without recipe books. He worked it out. You work it out. All 4 stared at him. He sighed. Cut along the stomach, scoop out anything that looks too detailed, and cook the rest. As a rule of thumb with innards, if it would take more than 1 colour to draw it, don't eat it. So kidneys are fine, all reddish-brown. Intestines less so, unless you're feeling exceptionally brave. But, just quickly before you go, how do we cook it? Said Lila. With fire. He smiled a half smile. Or that one, the blonde one wearing her face like a weapon in a baroon brawl, could try and cook it by glaring at it. Wait, please, just a second. Fred made a last effort as the man turned to go. Who are you? What do we call you? Where is this place? How did you get here? Are you an explorer? Do you live here? Are you planning to help us? We need to know. Fred thought of all the explorers he had read about. There were so many who had just strode into the jungle and never reappeared. Percy Fawcett and his son Jack, Raleigh Rimmel, Christopher McLaren. He tried to remember what the photographs in the newspapers had looked like. The man turned to face Fred full on. His face shifted from wry to something darker and harder to trace. I'm a bush pilot, not an explorer. I used to ferry supplies back and forth from the smaller towns to Manaus. I crashed here some years ago. What happened to your plane? What happened to yours? He countered. It burnt, said Fred. The man nodded. Exactly so. And your name? I'm Fred, and that's Lila, and that's Con, and Max. A look as blank as an iron wall came down over the man's face. I'm not interested in names. This is the Amazon jungle, not the Travellers' Club on Pall Mall. But what do we say then? Con asked. I mean, if we need your attention. His eyes went up so high they nudged at his hairline. You don't. And turned away. He strode across the square, his shoulders hunched, heading towards the place where the vines grew into an impenetrable curtain. He pushed past some branches and disappeared. His footsteps, despite their limp, were astonishingly silent. You scared him off, Max said to Con, his voice full of accusation. It wasn't just me, we all did, said Con. And technically, I think we annoyed him off. I didn't know, said Lila, that asking someone's name would be so controversial. I know what we call him, said Max. He beamed up at them proudly. We call him the Explorer. But he's just said he's not one, said Con, exasperated. Weren't you listening? He has an explorer's hat, said Max, and a vulture, so there. Okay, so that is another 2 chapters of our book done. We will carry on reading tomorrow, and it's almost the weekend, so we might have a break then. Okay, I will see you later. Bye!